Hey guys, this is a second screencast lesson for section 2 of your research paper. And in this one, I want to talk a little bit about how to use quotes in your research paper. Every year I think to myself, I'm like, oh, they know this. They've learned this before. I don't need to go over this. But inevitably, even among my AP students, if I don't explicitly remind you of this and, show you how to do it, I always have AP students who forget that they can't just drop in quotes. And, we talked when we did, I say about sandwiching a quote, making sure you have the top bun. And yeah, that's important, absolutely. But we also have to make sure we integrate the quotes grammatically. And so that's kind of what I'm here to go over with you today. So I'm going to show you some examples of ones that are done badly, ones that are done okay, a little bit better, and then ones that are done really well. Sophisticated quote integration is something that shows your reader that you know what you're talking about, that you're not just throwing in these giant quotes, and that you understand them and that you can actually work with them. This is what takes you from being a, ordinary average high school writer to doing college level writing and thinking. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen with you guys. And this is a document that I created. I'll give you a link to it so you can have the doc as well. But we're going to start off with this, just a quote. I can't remember if we read this piece or not. It was a little essay I think we did. It was by A.M. Rosenthal. It was about his trip to Auschwitz. But I just pulled out this one random quote. The most terrible thing of all, somehow, was that at Brzezinka, the sun was bright and warm, the rows of graceful poplars were lovely to look upon, and on the grass near the gates, the children played. All right, so the first example, all right, A.M. Rosenthal said, quote, and we have our citation Rosenthal 1. Okay, so this is really weak. Notice, red light, stop. It's weak for two reasons. I mean, it's not technically a dropped quote because we have our tag there at the beginning. We're integrating it into a sentence, but we don't know who A.M. Rosenthal is or what the context of the quote is. It's meaningless. Who is A.M. Rosenthal? What does this have to do with anything? We don't want to put quotes in like this. This is this giant block of uncontextualized quote. You don't want to put quotes like this in your paper, which you shouldn't, because you're doing they say, I say, and you've got a top bun. All right. So here's another bad example. And this is one that I definitely see my AP students doing. New York Times columnist A.M. Rosenthal wrote about his recent visit to Auschwitz. The most terrible thing of all, somehow, was that at Brzezinka, the sun was bright and warm, the rows of graceful poplars were lovely to look upon, and on the grass near the gates, children played. Well, on one hand, now it tells us who Rosenthal is, and at least what he was writing about. The worst problem with this is that this is a dropped quote. What you see here is a complete sentence. It actually needs a period after it, not a comma. And if we put that period there, you immediately recognize that, oh, that makes us a dropped quote. But students, AP students, will often just put a comma there and say, okay, well, I'm introducing the quote, done. But now not only have you used a drop quote, but you've now punctuated a sentence incorrectly and created a run-on. So you're in even worse shape. Don't do this. Be very careful about this. Whenever you have a tag phrase before the quote, make sure it's not a complete sentence. If it is, you've got a problem and it needs to be revised. All right. So here's one that's slightly better. Okay. New York Times columnist A.M. Rosenthal wrote about his recent visit to Auschwitz. He explains, and then our quote. Now, this one, obviously, it does what this one did well, which is contextualizing the quote, but it's also no longer dropped because we've added this little tag. It's not great. It's this giant block of text, and we can do better than that. So now I've got two examples that I'm going to show you that are potentially much better. New York Times columnist A.M. Rosenthal wrote, "There is no news from Auschwitz," about his recent visit to Poland. Rosenthal tells us first of how Terrible, it seemed, that it was a warm spring day with green grass and trees near, quote, near the gates where the children played. Rosenthal 1. Another example would be New York Times columnist A.M. Rosenthal wrote There is no news from Auschwitz about his recent visit to Poland. The very first thing Rosenthal tells us is of the sun being, quote, bright and warm, and, quote, graceful poplars near the gates where the kids were having fun. There's a few good things happening here. We do have the info about who he is and what he's writing about. We have the title of the article, which is helpful. We've also paraphrased most of the quote into our own words. We're quoting only the words that are vital to his description. This is sophisticated. It makes more of the voice yours, and it shows you understand the quote. There's usually not a need to quote the entire sentence. Pick out the parts that need to be quoted. Like, where is the author saying something really powerful that needs to be in his words? Otherwise, paraphrase it. And so that's what these two are doing well, right? The goal in your research paper is to aim for most of your quotes to be like these, the good, sophisticated examples. It's okay to have the occasional yellow one, kind of like this. But we definitely want to avoid the bad examples at all costs. This is something that at the AP level should absolutely not happen in your research papers. You get to college and write like that, your professors are going to be horrified. All right. So before we leave this screencast, I want to go back over and sort of, I want to go back and share my Chrome so we can go back to the sample research paper that we were looking at and look at my quote integration on there. There we go. Okay. So I want to take a look at, here, I'll do it over here. This is actually highlighted in a particular way for the next slide, but since I have the quotes highlighted over here, let's use this. In this case, I had my top bun, but then I said, he says, and then I've got the full quote, right? That one's pretty much like one of the, okay, it's better, it's not terrible, but it's not fabulous. And that's what we have going on here. One thing that we have here that I'll point out is we have a quote within a quote because Pertman was actually quoting the reformist mantra. And so if we have a quote within a quote, that inner quote goes in single quotation marks, whereas Pertman is in double quotation marks. If I had only quoted this part, the whole thing would just be regular quotation marks. Another example of quote integration here. According to Pertman, it felt like they were, quote, being asked to pay the price for violating a social norm. So in this case, I've sort of led into it in my own words and then quoted a pretty big chunk of a sentence right there. Down here, I did a little bit closer to what I did in the green quotes in that sample exercise. So as it turns out, these fears were not unfounded. These couples lamented what they called the, quote, almost whimsical nature of the process, in which they felt like Pertman, that they had little control over their outcomes. So in this case, I've actually paraphrased most of it. However, I left this in quotes because I thought it was really important to use their description, the almost whimsical nature of this process. That's a particular phrasing that I don't want to lose. I could paraphrase that they were lamenting it. I can paraphrase the fact that they felt they had little control, but the fact that they called it whimsical is definitely something I wanted to leave in quotation marks. This one down here is actually totally a paraphrase. I don't have any quote whatsoever, but it is directly from the book, which you can tell because I cited it. That'll be in the next slide. And down here again, I have a sort of half paraphrased, half quoted. One of the respondents in their study pointed out that most parents don't have to pass any tests to have children. The goal is that your quotes don't dominate your paper. And if you leave them in these giant quote blobs, for lack of a better word, they're going to start to take over your paper. That's what students do when they don't understand the quotes that they're looking at. If you can integrate it into your own thinking and your own words, that's a way to prove that you know what you are talking about and you understand the quote and how to use it. And that is it for screencast number 2. We have one more thing we need to learn about tonight, and that is how to do correct parenthetical citations for your research paper.